Stop streaming for just a second. Please bear with us while I figure out what indeed is going on, because we have hit a speed bump in our technology tonight. So I'm going to restream us, reconnect to the internet. I'm going to try anyway. Hold on just a sec. While I get a different feed. Okay. I'm pulling a different feed now. We should have us in a minute.
And you have to start all over again.
I wouldn't do that. Please don't. Are you getting anything?
Okay.
Hold on a second. It's fetching the stream. Here we go. Okay. Getting anything now?
No.
I guess we're not doing it tonight. I can't get a feed, Mar. I'm doing this the best I can, and it's not giving me a feed. It shows me on.
There we are.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. We were having some major technical difficulty. Let me pick up. You should see where you can find us. I'm sorry about the loss of the music. Every so often, something decides to go kaflooey, and when it does, there's not much I can do about it. So hopefully you weren't too put off by that. I'm going to continue from here. It might be a little choppy while I get the other part of this to go ahead and allow you to see the PowerPoint, because that's what we do these days. And so you're going to be able to follow the PowerPoint along with me. And so let's get started this evening. Hopefully everything is changing the way it should be. We've been talking about this objection as far as the Gospel of John. When I was growing up, one of the things that was often said was that the reason that there had been violence against Jewish people in church history was because the New Testament and New Testament writings were anti-Semitic, and they provoked that sort of response towards the Jewish people. And so we're going to look at some of the positive and negative uses of the term Jew in the Gospel of John. The positive ones really don't represent a problem, but the negative ones have been considered a problem. And so we are going to look at the negative ones. We're going to look at a few positive ones because it's also important to look at those also. And you should end up learning a little bit more about the Gospel of John. And so we're going to go through. Now, the PowerPoints aren't posted separately anymore. We did do that, and we're thinking of doing that. The problem is that you can't post a PowerPoint as a PowerPoint. You have to post it as a PDF. And so we want to make those resources available. But since you were seeing the PowerPoints as part of things, we backed off a little bit on that. This is where you guys get a chance to give us feedback. If you go to the page and if you go to the postings, or even if you go to YouTube and leave comments, that you want those PowerPoints up, and that you go to our website where it's noted where that can be reached. You can go ahead or go to our Facebook page even and post a comment that you'd like those PowerPoints, and we will make them available. We want to make them available again like we did before, but we also would like to know there's a real interest. It takes something to convert those PowerPoints to PDFs, and we want to know that they're a useful resource. We don't want to just do it because we're doing it. We want to do it because you're benefiting from it, because that's what we really want to see. And hopefully if you have individuals who are not believers, but that some of these topics touch, you can encourage them to watch the videos. We're a resource. We're also an outreach. And so I want to encourage you there. You will have this PowerPoint. You cannot download the PowerPoint separate from the video, though. So unless I put that up as a PDF, you have it embedded, and you just need to be aware of that. Well, let's get started this evening, and let's talk about it. We've already started to talk about it. Really, one of the joys was I was able to pick the references to the term Jew in the Gospel of John as a paper I did when I was in the Feinberg program. I think we were given several options, and this was one that I chose. It was of interest to me. Again, the Gospel of John was the last Gospel that I would have read before I was saved. In fact, when I started my search, I started in John and then went back to Matthew. I started a gospel study on John, and John didn't make a lot of sense to me. And so I didn't get back to John, and I've really begun to, in a greater and greater way, appreciate the Gospel of John. But understand that most people who are churched, the first place that they tell someone to turn is the Gospel of John. And if you're not prepared for this particular issue, and you share John with a Jewish friend who has heard that the New Testament is anti-Semitic, and he runs into some of these negative references, he might very well object to them and bring back the objection that John has a very low opinion of the Jewish people, and this is an anti-Semitic book, and it explains some of the anti-Semitism in church history. So this really is a very useful issue. Let's talk about the dating of John. Now, I think this is very important. Now, when I wrote this paper, I ran across what you always run across. If you do any sort of research on the date of biblical books, inevitably there'll be scholars that date it earlier. Usually those are liberal scholars. I can't say they're always liberal scholars, but I will say that liberal scholars tend to date certain books earlier. They tend to date Daniel way later because then it would be prophecy. And they get rid of the supernatural element to the book of Daniel. But John, they would probably date earlier. I have become more and more convinced, and I think there's good scholarship. There was good scholarship before, but it's really, as I look at John more and more, I would date it later. First of all, John's other writings are later. And two, I think the purpose of John ties it to a later date. I'm not going to let you know that right here. What you do need to know is there is good reason for a consensus of a date of around the 90s. That would place it after the Synoptic Gospels. Now, you need to understand that. The other three Gospels are called the Synoptics. Comes from a word meaning with the same view, because they're really a lot the same. John's really kind of different in the way it's laid out and the material, and there are some things in John that are not in the other three Gospels at all. So the other three are called the Synoptics. This means John was written, by best estimation, after the other three Gospels. We're going to see even more evidence related to that. James Utley, he has a commentary on the writings of John, makes this statement that apparently John develops the Gospel in light of the basic affirmation of the Synoptics. Now, what is he saying there? He's saying that John develops his Gospel, and it looks a little different, but he's developing it off the material that's in the other Synoptics, and he attempts to supplement and interpret the light and teachings of Jesus in the light of the needs of the early church around the 90s. And so what Utley is actually saying is it looks like John includes material that's not in the other three because he's supplementing the other three, and he's writing it for a later period, slightly later period than the other gospel writers. Remember, he is the last apostolic witness. He's the last of the apostles. And so Utley feels that it is most likely not only after the Synoptics, but he would certainly put it at a 90 AD or later period, which would put it after the temple's destruction. And I think that's very key to what's going on in John. As I've been able to plug that into the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John kind of jumped out at me in a whole new way. And so I'm going to encourage you to to start thinking about that. The term Jew, or the equivalent term in the Greek, to be more clear, because our English Bibles are translations from the Greek New Testament. There are several reasons why that term is used in John. And so let's look at some possible explanations. This is a good exercise. When you run across issues in the Bible, it's not wrong to look at sound possibilities to better understand the authorial intent. It's not wrong to say, well, given the situation, here are several possible things that might be being emphasized here by the writer. And then look at what fits the evidence. So let's look at those possibilities. Intersectarian, or what I call familial polemics. Now that sounds fancy, okay, but we talked about this before. There were different sects of Judaism. Do you think they got along? You know, the old joke is 3 Jews, 4 opinions, right? Obviously, these sects did not necessarily get along with each other. And so one of the possibilities is these are different sects within Judaism talking to each other, and they're one bettering each other. In other words, they're saying, we're the right sect, you're not the right sect, phooey on you. And that's one distinct possibility. The other is that there's only one usage. And then its usage is probably a reference to the geographic area of Judea. So it's like saying the Judeans, as opposed to the other geographic areas. Of course, the possibility is it could be a single usage, and maybe, and this is often used, we're going to talk about this, it's often talked about that maybe Jews equals the leadership only. The Jews being the leaders of the Jews. The representative leadership only. Now, here's a possibility. What if John's using the same term in more than one way based on the context? That's the multi-use theory, that there are multiple. And what we do is we use the context to figure out which usage John is emphasizing. We're going to see why this is a good option. But it's a distinct possibility, and it wouldn't violate inspiration at all. In fact, it would highlight inspiration, if anything else, because it would say that the Holy Spirit is emphasizing certain things or certain ways the term is being used to highlight something in different contexts. Now, we want to be careful with this. We don't want to just look at biblical words as having multiple meanings, and then verses as having multiple meanings. Each verse or section has one fixed meaning. But within the book, given unique contexts, we might be able to say that John has more than one use, and that wouldn't violate anything at all as far as inspiration, if the context would indicate that. Generally, the rule of thumb is a biblical writer using the same term in the same book should be regarded as it having the same meaning. But this is not impossible. Paul uses the term law in more than one way in Romans. He talks about the law of marriage. He talks about the law of Moses. He talks about the law of sin. And he's using the same Greek term, but he's not using it the same way, and the context determines it. And so this does happen, and the usage will be telling in a case like that, and there'll be reasons why a single meaning for the term is not necessarily the best. I want to give you the opportunity to look at the explanations because we're going to apply those. Let's talk about intersectarian. Let's dig a little deeper here. What about the idea that different sects are sort of yelling at each other, kind of like a family argument? And this is Jew versus Jew polemics. I like this explanation. I liked it in my paper. Do we ever see this happening? Yeah. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian, not always liked by the Jewish community. He did end up doing some work for Rome after Rome came in and won. And so he's sometimes viewed as a bit of a turncoat, but he's an excellent historian, and he is an excellent Jewish historian. And we've just got to be straight about that. And if you look at his writing, his history, to go ahead and elevate the view of the Jewish people in the eyes of the Romans, that too, we'd kind of say there's kind of an agenda there. That's an agenda that really is meant to be positive for the Jewish people. He points out, now you're going to hear the Sicarii, and you're going, what are the Sicarii? The Sicarii are the zealots, but they were a particular group of Sicarii and of zealots, and they knifed people. These are the guys that would stab you in the back. Okay, they were very nationalistic. Josephus does not like them. And some of his language, and you can see by the quote here, some of his attacks, the language is as vitriolic, the fancy word for angry, mad, nasty, as any in the Gospel of John might seem to contain. He castigates the zealots as a whole. He calls them impostors and brigands, banding together to incite many to riot, exhorting them to assert their independence. You can see that impostors and brigands are not what you call your friends at a cocktail party. This is very, very nasty sort of language. And I know maybe like there are some movies where brigands almost sounds kind of romantic. It's not meant romantic in this particular case. And so there's Josephus. This is inter-Jewish polemics. Josephus is a Jewish historian saying nasty things about a sect of Jewish people. This is not from outside. This is not Romans taking this point of view. This is not outside of the Jewish people. This is internal Jewish language here being used. And it's not pleasant language. So intersectarian polemics are possible. There's more evidence. Now, I will give you the references to these, but I couldn't fit them on the slides. And I'm coming to realize that when people are looking at slides, if they can't read what's on the slide and sort of follow along, something gets lost. These were longer quotes. Harvey Falk has examples of strong languages which are similar to what's found in John. This is interesting. He points out that the denunciation of the house of Shammai, there were two rabbinical houses that were big houses right around the time of Jesus. One was Shammai and one was Hillel. Beit Shammai would be the house of Shammai, be the disciples of Shammai, and the denunciation of Shammai's disciples by the Essenes is very vitriolic. They're calling each other nasty things. Okay? And he uses the term the founder of Christianity, almost pale in the vehemence when comparing the sage, and the sage is named there. Okay, that's an Anglicization. I didn't put the Hebrew up or the Aramaic up for the sage's name. He was one of the big sages. But he labeled his brother Jonathan, and there's the Talmudic quote right there, the reference. You can go to the Talmudic reference, you can see it. He labeled his brother the firstborn of Satan. I mean, that's pretty intense stuff. Okay, and this is Jewish on Jewish language here. This is not from outside. This is in-house stuff going on here. Is there evidence for intersectarian yelling at each other with shouted raises voices? What's the matter with you? Don't you understand what you're doing, you swine, you? Sort of language here. And it's inter-Jewish language. Where did I get this stuff from? Well, Harvey Falk wrote a book called Jesus the Pharisee. It's up there. For the New Testament, a reference out of Luke T. Johnson, New Testament Anti-Jewish Slander and Conventions of Ancient Polemic. This was actually out of the Journal of Biblical Literature. So I loved finding this. Josephus is around. There are different editions of Josephus. You can see the one that I picked out of Grand Rapids, Zondervan Publishing. That was the one I went with. Let's talk about the possibility that maybe we're talking about the people from the region of Judea, because the land was divided. I picked this quote deliberately. Andreas Kostenberger is no small scholar. That's Jewish for he's a big scholar. Okay. Um, and he notes something related to this. Furthermore, the term "the Jews" as a term used in positive senses certainly cannot be the Judeans alone being discussed. And he references John 11, 1 through 54. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, while many of the Jews gave comfort to Mary at the death of Lazarus, John 11:19. Many also put their faith in him, John 11:45. Obviously, Kostenberger's saying, well, the Jews as Judeans a little weak. I mean, you mean only the Jews from Judea put their trust in him and gave comfort to Mary at the death of Lazarus? It could be a single usage that it refers to the Jews from Judea, but I don't know. It's not so great. And Kostenberger, of course, I'm using Baker's Evangelical Commentary in an article by him. But I thought that was interesting. Now, he's looking at the positive uses. He's going beyond the negative uses, but he's saying, he doesn't like it so much. And I'm saying, he's got a point. He's got a good point here. This is logical. This makes sense. Seems he's pointing something out I need to really pay attention to. What about multi-use? Now, we talked about this. This is good. I like the intersectarian polemic theory. I did when I wrote the paper. I still think it has value to account for the negative uses. But my problem is intersectarian yelling at each other like Jewish people yell at each other doesn't account for the positive uses in John. Because if sects are fighting with each other, they aren't going to say nice things about each other. They're fighting with each other. This is vitriolic yelling at each other. And so, wow, I like that for the negative uses, but that doesn't help me with some of the positive uses. So I quoted one of my favorite dictums, Arthur Conan Doyle. My kids even gave it to me on my card carrier for my ministry cards. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. When I take all the evidence into account, I have to look at the positive as well as the negative. And so I'm in a situation here where I say, multi-use theory really has some value to it. Maybe John's making slightly different points between the positive and the negative uses. Maybe when he's using it positively, he's using it one way. Maybe when he's using it negatively, he's using it another way. Maybe even occasionally there's a way he's switching off even beyond that. Probably the best way to look at this is that John really is saying something or emphasizing something by the way he uses the term Jew in particular places. Well, that's wonderful. John's incredibly sophisticated. That's great. So let's try applying this, okay? I went to John 9:22 through 24, and I focused on this a little bit. This is a negative usage. What do I do with this negative usage? The parents said these things because they feared the Jews. See the term the Jews? For the Jews, there's the term again, had agreed that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, the Messiah, that's what the term Christ really means, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, he's of age, go ask him. And so they again called the man who was blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. This is a negative use of the term the Jews. If anyone confesses Jesus is the Messiah, the Jews will excommunicate him. Okay? Not a pleasant usage. Okay? And so Jewish people look at this, they read this, they say, look, they're making us look horrible. Now look how intolerant and nasty we look, and we put anyone out of the synagogue who believed in Jesus, and we're persecuting the followers of Jesus. This looks, this is nasty to paint us this way. Who is he painting this way is what we need to ask. The Jewish people as a whole? Now here's why this doesn't work. Who are they talking to? The parents. The parents of the blind man. What are the parents of the blind man? They're Jewish. Who was the blind man? He was Jewish. Can they be referring to all the Jews? Well, no, because the parents are Jewish and the blind man's Jewish. Okay? And the blind man isn't going to put himself out of the synagogue. And he's certainly not going to kick his parents out of the synagogue. And I don't think the parents are going to kick themselves out of the synagogue, so that doesn't work real well in the context. This is a negative reference. The leaders, well, that works pretty cool. I mean, who else has the authority to go ahead and excommunicate people but the priests and the leaders? And so that's a real possibility. The Judeans, that seems like less of a possibility. So here's a negative reference. And probably our best understanding here is, in this context, John is probably talking about the leadership. It really makes sense. Now, is that a real anti-Semitic comment? Well, not necessarily. If he's talking about the leaders, he's not talking about the Jewish people as a whole. And let's face it, we've had good leaders and bad leaders in this country. But what I say, because the present American president is not so nice, I therefore think all Americans are this way. That would be a really kind of stupid way to deal with things, wouldn't it? And so, I don't think John's necessarily being anti-Semitic. He might be pointing towards the leadership and the growing tension and animosity between Yeshua, Jesus, and the leadership of Israel at the time. Now remember, this is written in 90 AD. It makes sense. Let's talk about another one. Okay, this is kind of negative. For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and thought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. All the Jews? I don't think so. Because there were Jewish people following him. What you call the disciples. We demonstrated they were nice Jewish boys. I mean, they were Jewish. They knew Jewish things. They didn't deny they were Jewish. The Jewish people as a whole, no. The Judeans, maybe, but that sounds a little bit, we'll just leave it as a possibility, but probably not the best one. The leadership, now that makes perfect sense, because there's a growing animosity. We see this in the other Gospels, even though they're synoptics, between Jesus and the Jewish leadership. By the way, it's the leaders that go to Pilate. And so is it highly possible that they sought to kill him? Also, because he had done these things on the Sabbath, they felt he had violated, which he hadn't. Okay? He certainly had not violated the spirit of God's Torah. But he makes the point that he's Lord of the Sabbath anyway, which means he can make changes to Torah. But the bottom line is they felt that he was committing sacrilege. Who were the ones worried about this? The priests and the leaders. So probably the leadership here. It makes sense. Let's look at some of the positive uses. I love this usage. By the way, when you're looking at John, this gets skipped over so often. John 4:22. You worship, and I was talking to the Samaritan, woman, what you do not know. We worship, he's referring to the Jews, by the way. We know what we worship, or we worship what we know, depending on your translation. For salvation is of the Jews. By the way, that's a statement by Jesus. Now, he didn't say salvation was from the Jews. Salvation is from him, but pay close attention to that verse. That ought to get preached more. Salvation is of the Jews. In other words, the Scriptures and the Messiah come through the Jewish people. And they are the channel through which salvation came to the nations. It's a good reason to have Jewish missions on your budget. Whether you get something planted or not, salvation is of the Jews. God didn't necessarily, you're honoring God's channel. Could it be the Judeans only? Salvation is of the Judeans? No. The Jewish people as a whole had revelation from God, not just the Judeans. The leaders? I don't think so. I don't think John's pointing to the leadership in this verse. Probably the Jewish people in general. Salvation has come through the channel of the Jewish people. So his positive use is most likely the Jewish people. What's John's goal? Now let's look at these in terms of John's goal. He wanted to indicate, and this is why I really feel this is a post-temple gospel. Okay, the temple's destroyed. He says, I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know you have eternal life. If the temple was destroyed, doubt could arise as to whether the believers were the faithful covenant community. And also at this time there was persecution. So Gentile believers could be doubting that they're part of the right community because of persecution in general from Rome. And Jewish believers could be doubting on two levels. The destruction of the temple could have thrown a real monkey wrench because now rabbinical Judaism is starting. Be tempting to go back. Now what does this do? Well, if that's John's intention, what better way to accomplish that intention than to go ahead and use intersectarian polemic in terms of the negative usage for the leaders that represent the growing and forming rabbinical Judaism, while using positive references for the Jewish people as an encouragement. So he's not separating himself from the Jewish people. Salvation is, he records, Jesus says salvation is through or of the Jews, but the leadership that is continuing to oppose, well, they're not the right group. And let's look at how they've dealt with the one who came to be Messiah. So we're looking at John's goal. Let's see what we can get out of this as we begin to wrap up. First of all, is John an anti-Semitic book? No, because there are positive uses for the term Jew anyway. If I was going to write an anti-Semitic book, I wouldn't record Jesus' words, salvation is of the Jews. That's not the way to write something anti-Semitic. Isn't it interesting that the strong positive reference to the Jewish people in John 4:22 was ignored by anti-Semitic elements in church history, while the negative references were highlighted? Talk about cherry picking. John's negative uses of the term the Jew or Jews can be easily explained apart from anti-Semitism, distancing himself from the growing rabbinical Judaism, which Jewish believers were being further and further separated from. Even intersectarian polemic, even if you allowed it to refer to this sect versus other sects, none of those purposes are straight anti-Semitism. What does this mean? It's not an anti-Semitic book. The Gospel of John, even though it contains negative references to the term Jew, is not anti-Semitic because those references can have other purposes and there are positive references there. And so we need to take that into account. Let's begin to wrap up. The danger is triumphalism. It's a horrible, horrible thing. Our salvation should never lead us to, we're better than them. And I have seen it. I'll keep names quiet. There was a radio teacher, he's still around, who used to use the term heathen or pagan to refer to anyone who wasn't a Christian. I found that highly offensive even as a believer. An unbelieving Jewish person is not a pagan. He believes in the one true God. He believes wrongly about the one true God. Okay? But he does not a pagan. That's insulting. Heathen, pagan, be careful. In any of us, there's the potential for a little bit of pagan at any time. And we need to watch triumphalism. We follow the better one. We are not better than anyone. And that's what we need to be careful of. And that's an important point. Triumphalism is antithetical to genuine, heartfelt evangelism and love for the lost. So, John's gospel isn't triumphalist, anti-Semitic, and we ought not be either. Our message is that God wants to go ahead and redeem and save people from the corruption of sin which has entered humankind and which has infected them, and cure them of them so that they can be truly human and who they were created to be, and they are image bearers in the image of God. And so that needs to be our heart attitude. That needs to be the way we carry ourselves, not in triumphalism. And John didn't practice that. Jewish book, Jewish gospel, Jewish Messiah. Let's get that very Jewish message out to the whole world. Until I'm with you again, shalom, shalom. Well, despite everything, what do you think?
Sounding good. Good message.
Good. Well, there you go. Said I was done. I hope it kept it. Oh, it looks like. Okay. Just do this. Sometimes that helps. Well, it doesn't show on my Facebook page yet, but
Usually takes a little bit.
okay. Oh, I was live 35 minutes ago. Okay. Oh. Wow, it says 16 views already.
Not bad.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to put a all right. Done. Well, nice recovery after a hard start. I don't know why it did that.